Hi, folks. I'm live now. I hope you got your announcements, and I hope some of you will be joining me soon. Right now, there is nobody joining me. So I'll go ahead and make a few comments, and I'll wait for people to join me live. Hey, Karen and Dee, thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much indeed. Ginger, Karen, and Doug, and also Donna Diasio. Thank you very much for joining. Okay, our topic for tonight is the downward and rightward spiral in American politics and the pattern set by the Republicans since the 1980 election, which has led to the rightward spiral, and which the Democrats can't seem to do anything about. And recently in The Guardian, Bruce Bartlett, a very well-known analyst of American politics, High Lyle, who was important in the Reagan administration in working on their budgets for them, and who is well known for that, okay, and who has since distanced himself somewhat from the Republican Party. He remains a Republican, of course, but he feels the Republican Party has left him, that it's no longer the party of the Reaganites, okay, in Reagan, but he refers these days to the Republican Party as the party of the wonkers, the wankers. I'm not sure that the wonkers is the right way to pronounce it. It seems like I'm having a few technical difficulties here, so I will try to end the technical difficulties. There's my daughter. Hi, Devora. Very glad to see you online. I'm trying to make sure my connections are working here. Don't know why I keep having these technical difficulties, but I'm sure they will be cleared up in just a moment. Let me sort of make adjustments like those I made by yesterday, and I think I can pretty well stabilize this. I don't know why we have these continuing problems, but I will do my to the broadcast. Well, there I am. And I hope that there will not be any more technical problems and that I fix them for the evening. So anyway, Bruce Bartlett, who now refers to the Republican Party as the wankers, as the wanker party, is now has now offered a compelling analysis of American politics since the 1980s. And he starts off the explanation okay, by pointing out in The Guardian that the Republicans are pushing the big tax cut because they know they're probably going to lose next year and in 2020 as well. And they also know, or think they know, that the tax cut that they push through, if they get it through, will bind the hands of Democrats for years to come, forcing them to essentially follow a Republican agenda of deficit reduction, austerity, and therefore prevent any action on a positive and progressive sort of program by the Democratic Party. And the Republicans think that the result of this will be a steady erosion of support for Democrats that will put the Republicans back in power within a few election cycles. And if you look at the history of this, this is what happened during the Bill Clinton administration. Okay, according to many writers, he came into power in 1993 with a progressive agenda in mind. But there were large deficits to handle. There was a mess left him by the Republicans. And so he was prevailed upon by Bob Rubin to follow a rightward course instead, to raise taxes, to reduce deficits, to rely on the Federal Reserve to blow a bubble in order to create a false prosperity that led to the surpluses of the late but 90s. This caused a mild recession under Bush, but Bush spent the Clinton surpluses, okay, according to Bruce Bartlett. Of course, we know that surpluses cannot be spent because the money that surpluses gather from the public is destroyed in the process of taxation. So the surpluses can't be spent in any literal sense, but of course, from the point of view of the Democrats, their surpluses were spent by the Republicans in the Bush tax cuts and in the heavy deficits that were run by Bush. And along came the great crash, okay, of 2008. And when Obama came into office, he was faced with a big mess to clean up. Now, of course, the biggest mess of all was the downward flow, strong downward flow when he took office, and the danger of a depression. And so what he did was immediately a stimulus bill for the economy to get out of the downward spiral. However, that did not help him much because he accepted the fact that he had a deficit mess to clean up, and he immediately began to reduce the deficit, therefore pulling back on the stimulus to the economy, leading to the slowest recovery in history. Okay, and so, and here goes my camera off again. I'm going to have to do another adjustment, folks. I'm sorry to tell you this. It will take another couple of seconds for me to do this adjustment. More than another couple of seconds, I'm afraid. From my end, it still shows me on the screen, but from your end, I know that there's a problem At least I think there's a problem with my camera. Sure, there's a problem with my camera. Okay, so hopefully I am live again, okay, and you can see me again. I guess you can't see me yet, but you can hear me, okay, and you can see me now. And so when Obama came in, he had another big mess to clean up. And so once the stimulus was through, he reduced the deficit by governing to the right. And as he did that, he created the slowest recovery in history since the Second World War. And that recovery left many people stranded and many people unhappy. And so this was perhaps the biggest factor in 2017, other than the candidates, which the Democrats ran, probably the biggest factor in the victory of Trump. Okay. The American people were still dissatisfied. The Obama 2 terms had not brought them the prosperity they were looking for. The unemployment statistics were not a true measure of the recovery and not a true measure of the prosperity. Too many people were left out, and they made their dissatisfaction known in the election of 2016. So you now see the pattern. Okay, it's the Republicans running very, very large deficits, and the Democrats coming in thinking that they have to stabilize the debt situation, that they have to lower the debt in some way, and that they have to be fiscally responsible. And so they don't have policy space, they feel. They don't have the money, or so they say, to pursue progressive economic agendas, thereby leading to a loss of their popularity, to their defeat by the Republicans, and then to the Republicans doing the same thing all over again. Doing that thing under Clinton, after Reagan, doing that thing by Bush after Clinton, and doing that thing after Obama tried to fix up the Bush mess by moving rightward and by not passing any progressive programs, essentially giving the finger to progressives for 2 terms, okay? And then giving another finger to the progressives by running Hillary Clinton, supporting Hillary Clinton as his successor in office, thereby leading to the insurgency of Bernie Sanders, and then creating the victory. And then once she was nominated, in spite of Sanders' support, having Donald Trump very narrowly beat her by campaigning in some of the most dissatisfied states of the union, and her thinking she could win on the basis of identity politics alone and anti-Trumpism alone, and ignoring the economic problems of the American people. And then this led to Trump. And Bruce says, so now the Republicans are trying for big and damaging tax cuts. Once again, they're following the same formula because they know they will leave the Democrats with a mess again. And the Democrats won't be able to practice their progressive politics or enact any progressive programs because the policy space they will feel won't be there. And so he sees the Democrats, in the event of their victory in 2018 and 2020, once again shifting to the right in their programs to clean up the debt mess, because they are prisoners of programming of their campaigning, using the program of fiscal responsibility, or using a campaign idea of being fiscally responsible and reducing the debt, reducing the deficits, to reduce the growth of the debt, to improve the debt to GDP ratio, to bring once again financial stability before they do anything of a progressive character. So he thinks what the Democrats will do once again is to follow the old practices, try to sell a reduction of the deficit to the American people, and that the resulting austerity will once again lead to a further victory of the Republicans. In other words, preparing the way for the next Republican victory so they can drive us even further to the right, our politics even further to the right. So he sees this as a pattern that has obtained over nearly 40 years now, and he sees this as a trap which the Democrats are going to fall into, he believes. And he says, the only way out of the trap for the Democrats is to defeat the Republican tax cuts now. And he says, in the famous words of Star Wars, it's their only hope. The only hope is the Republicans defeating, or the Democrats defeating, the Republican tax cuts right now. All they need is Obi-Wan Kenobi to help them. So, what I'm here to say is, most emphatically, my message for tonight is, no, it is not their only hope. Win or lose on the tax politics of the Democrat or third-party victors, because it should be third-party victors on the left, of course, a New People's Party, that they, or a third-party victor in 2018 and 2020, can get out of the Republican death trap for American politics. And it's literally a death trap. It's a death trap when it comes to health care. It's a death trap when it comes to ruining lives. It's a death trap with respect to not doing anything about the climate. Literally, it's a death trap. The other hope, the best hope, in my view, the only hope for the Democrats when they win, or when the People's Party wins in 2018, in 2020, the only hope for getting out of the death trap is the simplest of all the solutions to the political and messaging problem of the debt, the public debt, the $60,000 each person is supposed to owe to pay off the public debt, so that it's no longer there for our grandchildren. So we lift the burden off our grandchildren. The only hope is, as I said a few days ago, but I want to hammer home the message here. When the victors get into power in 2018 and 2020, Okay, my camera's still gone. Do the broadcast. Okay, show. Okay, I hope I'm back. I was just about to deliver the message. Okay, so here we are again. Okay, so I hope I don't have to say another curse word, fellas and gals. Okay. Anyway, the simplest solution of the message tonight is make it standard Congress practice to include this clause or a formulation meaning the same thing in every appropriations bill or continuing resolution for federal spending. And the wording I offer is as follows. Upon passage of this appropriations bill, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account at the New York Federal Reserve with the addition to its reserve balance necessary to spend this appropriation. In addition, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account with the additions to the Treasury reserve balances necessary to repay all outstanding debt instruments, including principal and interest, as they fall due for the fiscal year of this appropriation. That is what those clauses have to say. And I guarantee that if those clauses are in the appropriations bills, are in the continuing resolutions bills, okay, are in any combination of those two, then that will begin the payoff of the debt without running any surpluses. There won't be any need for surpluses. There won't be any need for austerity. There won't be any need to raise taxes. There is a tax issue, okay, of course. If Congress directs the Fed to place the reserves directly into the Treasury account, then, of course, reserves have to be drained out of the system to the extent that is necessary to stop any inflationary tendencies from taking hold. So Congress will have to maintain the level of taxation that it has now. It may or may not have to raise taxes. It all depends on the level of deficit spending which the Congress engages in. But one thing that is very clear, if the funds are added directly to the Treasury account in order to pay off any outstanding debt instruments during the fiscal year of the appropriation, then the debt will be getting paid off. It will be going down, and no new debt will have to be issued. That's why the debt will be going down. That's why it will be going down. Now, you may look at this particular solution and you may say to me, well, this is perhaps not really that simple, because didn't Congress start up the Federal Reserve in the first place? and pass the debt ceiling bill in the first place, way back in 1917, because it wanted to impose a discipline on itself. It wanted to stop itself from coining an excess of money and giving it to the president to spend. And so it made a decision at that time not to monetize its appropriations and to let the Treasury Department seek to monetize the appropriations through taxing and through bond issuance. And since at that time we were on the gold standard and the bonds issued could not exceed our supply of gold to back them up, Congress felt in earlier times that this would apply a discipline to the economy at that time. And that's why they set up the financial system they did. It can be argued in 1913 and in the period following, including 1917 and the years thereafter, it could be said that Congress did this in order to tie their own shoelaces together so they couldn't run. That was the objective. So why should Congress turn around now and untie its shoelaces and give themselves and the Treasury Department together this complete freedom to spend based only on Congress's untying the purse strings? Untying the purse strings and ordering the funding of the appropriation directly from the Federal Reserve. Well, people might raise that objection and they might ask that question. But there's a very good answer to that question. And that answer is, we are no longer on the gold standard. We now have a fiat currency. And all of our currency in the broad sense, that is currency, okay, and reserves, okay, are created or issued by the Federal Reserve. The only thing the Treasury still creates and issues is coins. But we don't use very much money in terms of coins to fund federal spending at this point. Most of what we use is reserves created by the Fed. Yes, reserves created by the Fed. So, we have the Fed creating all the reserves anyway, creating the reserves in the same way, out of thin air, and filling up the Treasury account based on certain rules that Congress has set up over a period of time. What I'm proposing is a change of those rules so that the pattern is that Congress passes an appropriations or other bill mandating Treasury spending. They do that now. And then ordering the Fed and getting the Fed to mark up the Treasury spending account, adding the reserves sufficient to spend the appropriation and to repay the debt instruments that are falling due during the time of the appropriation. And so then the Treasury would obey Congress and would spend its appropriation and repays the debt that it's constitutionally mandated to repay as it falls due. Now, this simple pattern of 3 steps, this simple pattern, okay, of 3 steps is very, very easy to understand, is very, very easy to implement, and is completely in accord with the Constitution of the United States, except perhaps as the Federal Reserve is involved at all, because one can order that the Federal Reserve as an institution is an unconstitutional institution, in which case the funding pattern outlined here would be simplified even further, because the Federal Reserve won't even be involved in it. It would just be the Congress ordering the Treasury to create the reserves to spend the congressional appropriations. So what I'm outlining is completely constitutional. It's completely consistent with the fiat currency system we have now. It is perfect. It is perfect as a simple solution to the problem of the debt. And it completely gets the progressives or the Democrats, if they want to do it, outside of the Republican box. Because the debt and the political problem of the debt can be lessened and can be paid off over time at the same time as the federal government is creating prosperity and growth and full employment and health care for all and infrastructure and free education for all and solutions to the climate change problem and debt jubilees for students and for mortgage holders who were caught in the crises of 2008. In other words, it will be possible for social and economic justice to be fully created and for the planet to be saved. And for the planet to be saved while paying off the federal debt at the same time, using this very, very simple solution. So it's that solution which is our only hope. It's not defeating the Republican tax cut plan right now. Sure, I'd like to defeat that tax cut plan because it increases inequality. And that's bad for us, and it would be great to defeat that particular tax cut plan. But I'll tell you something. If the Republicans wanted to pass that tax cut plan now, and in return, they bargained with the Democrats, and they gave the Democrats this new appropriations process, as I've outlined it, making it standard congressional practice, passing it as the rule of Congress to include the two clauses that I outlined, I would take that deal in a New York second. I would take that deal in a New York second because we could do all the good things that we wanted to do because the right could no longer claim that the policy space did not exist to do those things. So they could have their tax cuts. We would win in 2018 and 2020 anyway, and the machinery would already be set up for us to pass all the progressive programs we wanted, with the only constraint being inflation, which means at that point we would have to reimpose various taxes on people, the taxes that are necessary to control inflation. Okay? And we might want to impose certain other taxes for creating greater equality then. That deal, in any case, would be a very good deal. So, now, okay, I've said my piece on this. And what I'd like to underline this is with something that I hope I can put up very rapidly at this point. Let's see, I should have actually prepared the way for this. I hope you can still see me and hear me. So, I hope you can see that well. That's the new three-step process for funding that would exist under the present system. Can you see it? Let me see if it's showing up on my screen. Let me see if it's showing up on yours. It should be showing up on yours also. I think it's out of the lobby and into the live area. So, I think what I'm going to do is to hide myself while leaving myself in the broadcast area, and then that should give you a full screen view. Do you have a full screen view of the figure on the markup, the sub process? Okay, I'll trust that you do, and I'll show myself again. Okay, here we are. So that's our only hope. That's what I recommend. That's what I want the progressives to do. First thing, when and if they get back in office in 2018, okay, in 2020, and it will be our job to see to it that progressives will be getting into office who will do this, not faux progressive Democrats who will not. Now, there are progressive Democrats, okay, a few, who would do this, okay? There are a few who would do this, but there are many others who would not. So, I'm going to take the graphic out of the screen now. Let me see here. Here, let me see if I can take it out of the viewing area. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I should have the full screen again. And now what I want to do is have a Q&A period. Susan Eldridge says, we need to clone Tim Canova. You bet we need to clone Tim Canova. Or maybe he has a plan for cloning himself. I hope he does. And Keith Evans asks, are we giving up on monetary policy at the Fed? No. They can still do monetary policy. They just have to follow the congressional directive to stop hamstringing fiscal policy. In other words, to stop being a handmaiden to the process of getting the Treasury to issue new debt instruments. Now, I know it's true that it doesn't matter for solvency whether we issue debt instruments or not. There's no limit to the debt instruments that we can issue, and there's no limit to what we can pay back. The debt problem is really not a financial problem for the federal government. It's not a solvency problem. It never was, and it never will be as long as we keep our fiat currency system. But we can explain that to people till we're blue in the face for years and years on end. And they are never going to believe that when they see the debt because of the powerful pull of their own experience with debt and with the private deficits that they endure. We can counteract that kind of education on a small scale. Probably among the elites, we can counteract that and we can win that war. But among the people, we probably cannot win that war, or at least it will take too many years. And I'm not about to wait for all the people to die who will die if we stick with the educational plan and we don't go instead with some kind of action plan to wipe out the debt and make it a non-issue. That has to be made a non-issue so that the education doesn't count so much, or that we have so much more time for education. The way to make it a non-issue, okay, the way to do that is to have a procedure for marking up the Treasury account that obviates the need to issue new debt instruments. Now, previously I advocated for the platinum coin, and I still think doing a platinum coin would be a great way to do this, but it's not as great a way as I'm suggesting right now. This is the simplest way, the most transparent way, and the most demonstrable way to teach people that the Congress still retains the power to coin the money, and that it has only delegated that power in some part to the Treasury Department and to the Fed, and that it can still direct both the Fed and the Treasury Department to both to spend and for the Fed to fill the coffers of the Treasury Department so that it can spend and so that it can repay debt without having to issue any more debt instruments. If we pass this, it will demonstrate continuously every year that Congress still has that power, that it is in the driver's seat when it comes to spending and when it comes to taxing, as is specified in the Constitution. That's what we have to accomplish. Anyway, Carmen Muniz says, the fetishers are finally going to have a heart attack when they see this. Maybe they'll be gone for good. Well, Carmen, it's hard to keep a good man down, right? So I doubt it'll keep the fetishers down. I think they're just going to invent another fairy tale. And that's all that's going to happen. So, anyway, Russell Goldman asks, can you repeat your two clauses? Yes, I can repeat my two clauses, but I can do better than repeating my two clauses. What I can do is I will repeat the two clauses, but in addition, I will add the two clauses in a comment. In fact, I will add all 3 bullet points on my presentation. Right now, so that you have them. Okay? Okay, there they are. I hope that's clear, Russell, and I'll read them for you. Okay, the first bullet point, make it standard congressional practice to include the following clauses or a formulation meaning the same thing in every appropriations bill or continuing resolution for federal spending. And I also mean to include here those bills that combine the authorization with an appropriation order, because there are many bills like that also. So, upon passage of this appropriations bill, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account at the New York Fed with the addition to its reserve balance necessary to spend this appropriation. That's the first of the clauses. And the second clause is, in addition, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account with the additions to the Treasury reserve balances necessary to repay all outstanding debt instruments, including principal and interest, as they fall due for the fiscal year of this appropriation. That's the second one. I think that covers all eventualities. Of course, the Fed, in order to implement that, is going to have to ask the Treasury for an estimate of how much in funds, in newly created funds, they will need in order to to repay the debt instruments falling due during the fiscal year, and in order to pay the interests on those instruments during that fiscal year. The Treasury always has those estimates handy. They're very, very good estimates. They're almost accurate to the dollar, almost accurate to the penny. There won't be any problem providing those figures to the Fed. It can be done overnight. And once it's done, the Fed will be mandated by the congressional order to send those funds into the Treasury spending account. And that will be that. No more debt issuance by the Treasury. Well, someone might ask, well, what then? How is the Fed going to reserve? How is the Fed going to drain reserves from the economy? How will it drain reserves? And the answer is very plain in the MMT literature. It is the Federal Reserve can pay interest on the reserves that it holds. It does so now, but it pays interest at rather low rates now. It can raise the interest rates that it pays, the interest that it pays on reserves, that rate. It can raise that to whatever it wants to raise it. And that will give people the incentive they need to keep the money they have in their checking accounts, in their reserve accounts, that is, sitting in their reserve accounts at the Fed. And of course, these are not general people. These are other nations or large institutions that have accounts at the Federal Reserve. And they will keep their reserves in their accounts and won't send them into the economy where they can have an inflationary impact, because the Federal Reserve is giving them a very good return on their money. Now, one may inquire, well, we're still giving these private people lots of money just for their money being held by the Federal Reserve in this case, as opposed to the Treasury. So what benefit do we gain? We gain the political benefit, because the damned right won't be able to say, look at the size of this debt that we all owe. Look at the burden it's going to place on our grandchildren. Look at the $60,000 per person you owe. They won't be able to say that anymore, because that debt will be getting paid down each and every year. 50% of that debt will probably be paid down in 3 years. So the 20 trillion will be 10 trillion or less at that time. Within 10 years, it'll probably be paid down to 1 trillion or something like that, if there is even 1 trillion in 30-year debt instruments out there. I'm not even sure there is that out there. So we're talking about a pretty rapid disappearance of the U.S. debt, making that so-called growing debt a non-issue. It won't be growing, it will be declining, and making the size of the debt a non-issue, because it will be very small, and making the debt to GDP ratio a non-issue, because the debt to GDP ratio after a few years will be getting more and more minuscule. So it takes these issues off the table. Okay. A lot of what gets done in politics is appearance. It's psychology. It's perceptual. Changing the perceptions is everything. Changing the messaging. Well, it's not everything. Changing the messaging is 80% of the battle. Okay? Making the debt messaging irrelevant is 75% of the battle of getting progressive policies that will cost money enacted. putting the Peterson Foundation out of business is 60% of the battle. Well, maybe not 60% of the battle, but you get the point. This would be disempowering the austerity institutions that currently run the political landscape, including the Republican Party. It would be disempowering them. They would not be able to run this con on the Democrats anymore that they've been running for nearly 40 years now. Now that will either expose the Democrats as a sham party, or it will run the faux Democrats off the reservation and back into the Republican Party where they belong, because there will be no faux fiscal responsibility space for them in the Democratic Party anymore. That's of overwhelming importance in pushing the Overton window to the left. And that is, of course, what we most want to do. And Rocco says, so this would do away with offsetting deficits with bonds? It certainly would. There would be no more bond issuance because the Congress would be ordering the Fed to fill the Treasury account with the money it needs to pay back all the old instruments, and it would also be ordering the Fed to fill the Treasury account with the amount of any current appropriations, including those appropriations which would be deficit spending. So deficit spending, the funds for that would be directly injected into the Treasury account as they are right now by the Fed, but without the funny game in back of this of collecting taxes or issuing debt instruments on the pretense that the money from those things is not destroyed but flows into the Treasury spending account. We know that that's not true. But to other people, it seems like it is true. So it seems like we need these bonds offsetting the deficits that we run. But this new procedure would give the lie to the whole thing, because it would show people that it's just up to the Congress to order the Fed to directly create those reserves and place them in the Treasury account. And that is what funding for federal spending is really all about. It's about the appropriation, and it's about the Fed using its authority from Congress to fill the Treasury spending account. It ain't about anything else. Not in reality. Only in pretense is it about anything else. And what I'm proposing to do here is to remove the pretense and make the process transparent. And I have to say, I haven't seen any of the other MMTers suggesting this in so many words. I've heard them talk about following a zero interest policy and continuing to issue bonds. That's a favorite of Warren Mosler's. I've heard them joining me in saying, well, mint the coin. And that can certainly be done. I've heard them say, well, the money really directly comes from the Federal Reserve anyway. How large our debt is doesn't really matter. It doesn't count. And we can pay whatever we have to pay in interest at all times, and we have no solvency problems. And they say that again and again and again. But what they don't offer is this simple solution to the political problem of the national debt. Maybe it's because they're economists and they don't tend to look at problems that are political or that are messaging as real problems. I don't know. I can't fully explain it, and I won't even try. All I know is that I'm the only one of the MMTers that I know who has proposed language like this to change the situation, to put that language into the appropriations bill. Okay, if anybody else has suggested it, then I apologize, and I stand corrected. And here comes the interference again. I have no idea what's causing it. I may have to tune out again for a minute. If I do, please excuse me. And Dina Wilcat says, I want to move just so I can vote for him. I don't think you're talking about voting for me. I suspect it's probably Tim Canova. And Mark Fabian says, exactly. And Russell Gorman says, agreed, make the debt a non-issue. And Rocco Million says, yes, yes. Okay, now, I haven't had a chance to run any Q&As for a while because, oh, here I go again. Okay, the interference is now taken over, and I have to step out for a minute and then come in, but I shall return. Okay, I seem to be back. I don't think I'm showing, but I think I'm back, and now I think I'm showing. Is that right? Okay, I seem to be back, and again, it seems to be steady. I don't know why it becomes unsteady, but I think we're handling it now, even though we're handling it in an awkward way. So as I was saying, I have had a limited time for questions in my last few live streams. In fact, I haven't had any time, especially in the live streams on the Economist for Peace and Security, a conference, and the review of the conference that was given by Lana Dell and myself. Okay, and I think perhaps some of you may want to ask some questions late that have arisen in relation to those live streams. So feel free to ask those questions or make those comments here, and I will do my best to answer them. Okay, I do have to end with this broadcast in roughly 20 minutes, but I have until then. So, yes, Facebook does fail much of late. I agree. Karen Reese says that. Are there any other questions coming to the fore that I can tackle, okay, at this point? Are there any questions at all you'd like to ask me about anything? Is this procedure I've outlined now plain? If this procedure is plain, then what I'd like to see you do is to call your congressmen and your senators about it and ask why they don't have a clause like this in their appropriations bills right now because if they had those, we wouldn't have to issue any more debt instruments. Issuing more debt instruments would be gone. Paying off the old debt instruments would be provided for. Therefore, the debt problem would be gone. Therefore, the debt problem is currently Congress's fault. The fault of your congressmen, the fault of your senators. It is their fault in the precise sense that they could end the problem by making it standard congressional practice to include these clauses in their appropriations bills. So they need to put into their appropriations bills these clauses or accept the responsibility for the national debt problem. And Scott Burge asks, hi Scott, what are the counter arguments used by the right? I don't know what counter arguments they would come up with to oppose this change. But I'm not sure it matters what they come up with, because there is no valid counter argument to this. They will come up with all kinds of wild counter arguments, mostly focusing around the inflation that's bound to occur because we don't issue debt instruments. Well, we can show, and our economists have shown for a very long time now, that direct funding of the federal government, of the Treasury Department, but by the Congress, would be no more inflationary than issuing debt instruments is. In fact, there's an argument that using debt instruments is more inflationary. And the reason why it is more inflationary is because debt instruments can be borrowed against and can be leveraged actually multiple times. So even though the initial effect is to drain money out of the economy, all right, the effect of having the debt instruments, of selling the debt instruments, is to give the companies and the large actors a power to leverage those debt instruments and expand their free financial power in the economy even more if they so wish. So the draining through issuing debt instruments doesn't really work. It's not like taxes. I mean, taxes work because the net financial assets are confiscated by taxes and are destroyed by the Federal Reserve and the banking process. They don't fund federal spending, but they do take away net financial assets from those who are taxed. But selling bond instruments does not do that. Undoubtedly, the right will talk about lack of discipline in the federal government and blah, 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 okay, and blah, blah, blah. They're going to have a real easy time talking about lack of discipline right after they've passed a $1.5 trillion tax cut for the rich. They're going to have a real easy time trying to say the Democrats are being fiscally irresponsible by asking for this clause. And when the Democrats fire back and say, look, it's because this is not in your appropriations bill that we have a national debt. And we were complicit in that in previous years, but no more. We're not going to do it anymore. We want these clauses in the appropriations bill. And we're not going to vote for any appropriations bill until these clauses are in the appropriations bill. And when we win in 2018 and 2020, these clauses are going right into the appropriations bill. And we're going to use these to pay down the national debt and get rid of the national debt. And the next time you get in power, if you want to remove these clauses, we're going to fry your butt about that, because we're going to let it be known far and wide that you're about issuing debt again. And you're about making the federal government owe money again, because you won't stick with these particular clauses. I think that puts us in a very powerful political position against the right. These clauses do that. And we've got to pressure our congresspeople now, especially our Democratic congresspeople, to get these clauses into, well, the Republican congresspeople too. Everybody should be pressured. Why should they be allowing a situation to remain in which we issue debt? They're the ones who hate debt and say it's so terrible, it's so horrible. Well, if they believe that, then it should be an open and shut case that they put these clauses in, if that's what they believe. And if they don't believe it, they need to shut up about it. But for the Democrats, they need to put these in, not because they believe the debt is a real issue, but because they can see that it's a political issue that has driven them rightward for more than 40 years now. Actually, this damned orientation started under Jimmy Carter. Didn't even start under Reagan. In the latter part, of the Reagan administration. It was Jimmy Carter who first drove strongly for a balanced budget. He never made it, but he came actually pretty close and did much to cripple his administration by trying to get as close to a budget surplus as he could get. Small state governor that he was. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, I guess. Any other questions? My congressmen are Leahy and Bernie. No, they are your senators, John Arthur Lawrence. Leahy and Bernie. And Bernie would be, when the Democrats take over, if he remained as a senator, he would be the chairperson of the Budget Committee. And Pat Leahy would be the chairperson of the Senate Appropriations Committee. So the senators from Vermont, between them, would hold the power to get these clauses into the appropriations bills and to cram these clauses down the throat of the House, whether or not it was run by the Republicans or the Democrats. But if it was run by the Democrats, it would be that much easier to get these clauses adopted in the House too. And once they're there, and once people see the debt going down, over the period of the first year, there would be a gigantic reduction in the federal debt. I mean, a lot of this debt is 3-month debt, and 6-month debt, and 9-month debt, and 1-year debt. A huge amount. In other words, the national debt, lots of those involve 3-month debt instruments that are rolled over and rolled over, and rolled over. So, when you look at the amount of debt that is constantly paid back by the federal government now through the year, I mean, it's something like a figure, if I'm not mistaken, last time I looked, you can find this out, though, from looking at the daily Treasury statement and looking at it at the end of the 2017 fiscal year. Okay, that 2017 fiscal year is now over. We're in the 2018 fiscal year now. So in the 2017 fiscal year, probably as much as $70 trillion in debt was repaid by the federal government during the fiscal year. In other words, you have to understand that even though we are maintaining a level of $20 trillion now in terms of total debt, that debt total, which is fairly stable, is the product of dynamics involving payoffs and new issuance of debt, but constantly. And the payoffs are probably right now in the neighborhood of $70 trillion a year. I'd have to look that up to tie down, the figure. But it's an astonishingly large amount, dwarfing the $20 trillion. So the point is, in 1 year's time, these clauses would cause a gigantic and highly visible reduction in the federal debt, probably from 20 trillion to $16 trillion, just by adding these clauses to the appropriations bills. And Rob Rivera says that he's not sure what questions to ask. He says, Joe, the only critique I have is sometimes you use very technical language that becomes confusing for many. And and he says, I'm referring to the last two shows you had with Jamarl Thomas. Well, yeah, those were questions I was getting from Jamarl. And Jamarl's a fairly, sophisticated person, so it wasn't actually my presentation. It was my, giving answers off the cuff to somebody else who's fairly sophisticated himself. So I'm afraid I did use some technical language in that particular interview. I'm having another interview with him, by the way, next Saturday on December 2nd. He's coming back to RP for another interview. And Rob, I will take this under advisement, and in that interview, I will try to use as little technical language as I can. Okay, and Karen Reese says, yes, Mark has it. Yeah, Mark Fabian she's talking about. Karen would like a letter with my name on it. Well, actually, it should be a form letter, or it should be a letter that you might use and modify in some way to make it your own, to send to your congressman, and to your senators. Get this started all over the country. Get it started in petitions. Get this started as a bloomlet for Congress to see. Because I'm telling you, you want to see the national debt go away, either because it's a political problem or because you believe it's a real problem, this solution will take it away. I guarantee it. Within 3 years, 2/3 of that debt, at least, maybe 3/4, is going to be paid off within 3 years. And you won't have to worry about it ever again. And so, Mark Collins, are the CBO board and Fed chair and members in a conflict of interest? If they have or are soon to be employed in the banking industry, should not all these offices be chosen from regulators and academics rather than from the bankers? Okay, well, yes, I think they should, Mark Collins, but okay, the CBO is a congressional agency, and I don't think it's run by a board of directors. It's run by people directly appointed by the Congress. Okay, but as for the Fed, the banking industry has a big voice in the board of governors appointments. But of course, that's not a necessary thing. The offices, we could make a small change in the law where we could appoint people's representatives to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. Okay. But in a way, it doesn't really matter much because the Fed chairman is very dominant, and the end result could be that if the president is sufficiently vigorous and if Congress wants to do it, they can make very clear to the Board of Governors that they don't want to see the Board of Governors conducting the monetary policy of the United States in ways that suit the interests of the banking industry. And it could make clear that if certain members of the Board of Governors don't like that, that they can resign before the Congress itself decides to get rid of them, which it can do in various ways. So I'm not really concerned about that as a political factor. I mean, I think the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, when it comes to the public now, okay, not when it comes to the banking industry, but when it comes to the public at large, they have less influence with the American public than the Pope, in my view. And I don't think the Pope has a hell of a lot of influence. If he did, we'd be a lot more progressive than we are now as a country. Okay, more live comment. Well, I've got only about 2 minutes left, so I'll be able to take only one more comment. The Treasury wouldn't have to sell securities or sweep the TT&L accounts to fill their spending accounts. The Fed would just fill them. Yes, Gregory Paul Smith. That's exactly it. That's exactly what would happen. The TT&L accounts would not have to be swept. Okay, of course, the Fed could make a private agreement with the Treasury to take some of the money that the Fed had previously given to the Treasury Department, and it could very politely ask the Treasury to place some of these funds in commercial banks so that they were still in the private sector under similar arrangements to the TT&L arrangements which the Treasury has had with the Fed in the past. I mean, that can always happen, but that's really not a factor. In other words, when the Treasury actually needed the money, it could just say so, and the Fed would mark down the private accounts and mark up the Treasury accounts. The money would always be there. Okay, so now it's 10:56. Rob, have you ever thought of talking with Mike Norman to craft effective language to communicate MMT ideas? Well, no, I think that Mike is effective in certain ways, okay, in certain respects, but I think we here at RP are pretty effective also. We're very effective in our meme development and in our meme presentation. Steve Grumbine is certainly very effective. And we have many other people who are very effective here. And I think that I can rely on them. So, Rob, yours is the last question, okay, that I can take. It's 10:57, and I have a private meeting set up for 11 o'clock. So I hope you all enjoyed this. And I'm going to say good night. I may be doing another live stream sometime during the week. Okay, so watch for it. I'll definitely be here next Saturday night, okay, at 8 p.m. for another conversation with Jamal Thomas. And we'll work up the topic but together. And we promise to avoid the technical lingo for you as much as we possibly can. How about we collectively send certified letters? Well, I don't know what you mean by collectively send. I think the letters should be as individualized as possible, though I'll be happy to write a sample letter. Okay. But when we send letters to Congress, yeah, if you want them to be taken more seriously, it's probably fairly important that it's probably fairly important, okay, that they be certified. So anyway, good night. Thank you all for your suggestions and for your comments. And thank you for your attendance tonight, which was very, very good, I think. And I will see you when I see you, and certainly by next Saturday. Thanks again.